Among the old receipts, the letters, and all the other unsorted rubbish of years, in a little drawer by itself, there was a small black account book. Lina looked at it, cursorily at first, and then, because she did not understand the entries, more carefully. It was full of lists of curious names, preceded each by a date and followed by a sum in pounds. And in front of the pounds there was a plus or a minus sign, in red ink. One or two familiar names in the lists caught her eye, and she realized at what she was looking. It was Johnny's betting book. There was no need for her to do any calculations. Johnny had done them for her on the opposite pages. At the time of Beaky's death, Johnny had been nearly £13,000 on the wrong side. He had been betting continuously, ever since he had first begun, nearly 8 years ago. There was no gap shown, even after Lina had come back to him at the beginning of last summer. In another drawer, Lina found the rest of the story. Demands from bookmakers, letters from moneylenders, threats of proceedings, and all the rest. Her mind had been so bludgeoned that it hardly felt the extra blow of learning that Johnny had actually borrowed money on the strength of his expectations under her own will. But the thing was plain enough. There were letters dated within the last month whose tone was unmistakable. Their writers meant business. If Johnny did not pay, Johnny would be jailed. Johnny had been desperate, and Johnny had taken desperate steps. There could be no glossing over the thing this time, no finding smooth words to veneer plain facts. This was murder. Lina knew that in whatever light she might have persuaded herself to regard her father's death, she could not do the same thing now. This was murder. With mechanical neatness, she put the papers back in the drawer exactly as she had found them, and went upstairs to lock herself in her bedroom. She had been wrong. Johnny had not touched bottom before. He had found yet another profundity to plumb. But this time it did not even enter Lina's head to run desperately away from him. For a fortnight or more, Lina lived in almost continuous panic. Her terror was so great that it very nearly swamped every other emotion. Horror and despair were almost lost in fear. Her panic was lest Johnny should be caught. At first it seemed to her impossible that Johnny should not be traced. Every time there was a knock at the door, every time the telephone bell rang, she lived through Johnny's arrest and conviction for murder. In Bournemouth, she found herself hurrying past policemen. Even the village policeman at home ceased to be a rather quick-witted rustic and became a figure of sinister significance. Her nerves were worn into rags. She would look at Johnny, sitting there so merry and unperturbed, and could hardly stop herself from screaming. She felt herself and Johnny cut off from the world, outcasts from humanity, marooned on a desert island of guilt. She and Johnny, all alone. For this time, she was as guilty as Johnny, guiltier, because she was the responsible one of the two. She had known that Beaky was going to be killed, and she had not uttered a word to prevent it. And Beaky had paid for her pusillanimity with his life. Lina wept and wept for Beaky, and her own cowardice, till she could hardly use her eyes for anything but weeping. Johnny was much surprised that she should show so much feeling for a man whom she had always professed to dislike. Bitter, self-accusatory remorse was the only feeling which could struggle through the panic to the surface of her mind. There was scarcely any repulsion against Johnny. Lina knew exactly what had been the process of his twisted mentality. I know that half a pint of brandy will kill a man. Beaky ought to know it. If Beaky, with the knowledge that he ought to, and indeed may have, is such a condemned idiot as to swallow half a pint of brandy, then that's Beaky's funeral. Nothing to do with me at all. It had been Beaky's funeral, and Johnny had merely profited by it, just as the distant cousin had profited by it. Murder? What an extraordinary idea. If anything, Lina felt more protectively responsible for Johnny than ever. Johnny could not be held to account for what he did. Johnny simply did not know. Lina's protectiveness did not extend to the world in which Johnny was loose. But if there was not repulsion, there were moments of horror. There was horror when Lina, watching the progress of Johnny's betting book and Johnny's drawers, now every day, came across a batch of receipts 5 days after Beaky's death. Receipts from moneylenders, totalling nearly £14,000. They underlined Beaky's death so dreadfully. Johnny had been desperate, and now Johnny was square again. Beaky had fulfilled his purpose. But there were no more entries in Johnny's betting book. Perhaps Johnny too had known something about panic. There was more horror when Lina remembered that evening in the drawing room, when Johnny had seemed to be trying to make Beaky drunk for no reason at all. Lina knew now that there had been a reason. She knew now that she had been present at a rehearsal of Beaky's murder. Gradually, her panic subsided. There were no further references at all in the newspaper to Beaky's death. The French police had probably despaired of finding Beaky's companion. Slowly, Johnny's complete confidence had its influence on Lina. She became calmer. Her nerves rehabilitated themselves. Her trembling fits ceased. She could pass the policeman in Bournemouth without averting her head. But she still had that curious cut-off feeling, as if she and Johnny ought not to be mixing at all with decent, law-respecting people. However, there were still no more entries in Johnny's betting book. Lina almost cried again with relief about that. She was ashamed to catch herself thinking quite seriously that if only Beaky, so useless in life, had, by his death, cured Johnny of that terrible fever, he had not died for nothing. When she felt better, her conscience would not let her rest till she had tackled Johnny on that point. To tackle him on that other and so much greater point had never once entered her mind. She could not have done it. "Johnny, look here. I want to speak seriously to you about something. I've got more than a good idea that you've been betting a lot lately. No, don't say anything, I know you have. Well, darling, I just want to tell you this. I can't bear that any more." "As how?" Johnny grinned, the carefree grin of one who owes money to no man. "What I want to tell you is that if you ever make a bet on a horse again, Johnny, I shall leave you. I mean that. And I shall know." "You would you?" "How?" "Never mind. I should. And you ought to know me well enough to be sure that when I tell you I should, I should. And if you do, I'm finished, that's all." "Well, darling, I don't see how the devil you can know, but it's perfectly true. I have had a bet or two lately." Johnny said seriously, "But I'll swear to you, if you like, that I never will again. Never. The game isn't worth it. My God, no." "Oh, do please stick to that, Johnny," Lina cried. She really believed that this time Johnny would stick to it. There had been a look on his face as he said that the game wasn't worth it. He meant that. Lina had not the least doubt that Johnny must have killed Beaky, only with the greatest regret. Chapter 17. Lina wished sometimes that there were a few more people of her own age in Upcottery. They all seemed so much older or so much younger. Lina felt herself at least a generation more youthful than anyone at all older than herself, for in the country people age so quickly. And of the younger ones, like Marjorie and Joan Baldron, the very knowledgeable daughters of the vicar, she was almost afraid. They were so very much more sophisticated than she could ever be. Lina felt uncomfortable when people made sex abnormalities a subject of drawing-room conversation, even among their own sex. Now that Michael Caddis was permanently away, and Janet, fleeing, as Lina suspected, from Johnny, had got work with a business firm in London, Lina found herself very much alone. Her mother, too, of whom she had always been very fond, had died the year before. But Lina was interested in her house, and actually liked housekeeping, so that she was seldom really lonely, and she still read a great deal. Nevertheless, she had been very glad to get a letter one day from Joyce, after she had been back with Johnny about 2 years. Dearest Lina, did you ever meet Isabel Sedbusk when you were with us? I hear she has taken a cottage for the summer quite close to you, at Maybury. You might like to get in touch with her. Don't be alarmed if you haven't met her before. She's not nearly so formidable as she looks. In fact, she's a very good sort. No nonsense, and intelligent. But keep off religion. I've written to her that you may look her up. Your affectionate sister, Joyce. P.S. In case you didn't know, she writes detective stories. Lina had known that, of course. Anyone who ever read anything knew that Isabel Sedbusk wrote detective stories. She did not, however, think that she had met her in London, and when she went over to Maybury to call, she was sure of it. No one who had once met Isabel Sedbusk could ever have any doubts on the point afterwards. Miss Sedbusk impressed. That had been at the beginning of the previous summer, and Lina, who had liked Miss Sedbusk at sight, had seen quite a lot of her. Johnny was delighted with her too. Miss Sedbusk, who boasted of weighing 15 stone, and boomed in proportion, was a very easy person to get to know. She was inclined to talk a little too much about her own line of work, and liked showing her familiarity with the tools of her trade, such as blood and rigor mortis, but she was amusing and had plenty of other interests as well. In spite of the fact that she wore black sombreros and had a masculine cut about her clothes, she was an ardent feminist. Within 6 weeks, she was calling Johnny old man and rating Lina for not trying to write detective stories. "Anyone can," affirmed Miss Sedbusk. "It's just a matter of hard work, that's all. Lucky for us that more people don't know that, though. The market's overcrowded enough as it is. My publisher tells me." The next summer, Miss Sedbusk took the same cottage again. Lina was surprised to find how pleased she was to hear it. Within 2 days of her arrival, Miss Sedbusk appeared in person, demanding tea. She had walked the 4 miles from Maybury, and quite intended to walk them back again. The 2 women bumped cheeks. "Well, how are you, Lina? Fit?" "I am glad to see you, Isabel. I've missed you." "Have you? Good. I like people to miss me." "I'll tell Ethel to bring tea at once. Shall we have it in the garden? It's such a lovely day." "Anywhere you like," acquiesced Miss Sedbusk. "What I want is the tea itself. Well, how's Johnny?" "Johnny's very fit. He's in the garden somewhere. He's taking up roses this year in real earnest." "Well, I suppose we all come down to it one day," pronounced Miss Sedbusk. Lina took her guest into the garden, and they sat under the cedar by the tennis court. It came into Lina's mind that it was on this spot that Lady Fortnum had lost her diamond pendant so many years ago. How many was it? It must be nearly 9. She no longer had any illusions about that loss. It was lucky that there had been no writer of detective stories present then. "How's the new book going, Isabel? I suppose you're in the middle of one as usual?" "Not yet. I've been putting it off till I got down here. I'm held up for an idea." "Oh? You usually have so many ideas." "I want a new method of murder. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to think up new methods of murder. Everything's been done." It was a favourite complaint of Miss Sedbusk's, the difficulty of finding new methods of murder. Something prompted Lina to say, "How about one man persuading another to drink a tumblerful of neat whisky, the first man knowing it will kill him, and the second not knowing it?" "Been done," said Miss Sedbusk briefly. "Oh." "Been done in real life, too." Lina started. "Has it?" "Palmer got rid of one of his victims that way. Abbey." Miss Sedbusk knew the names of all the historical murderers and their victims. She really was interested in murder, besides making it vicariously her profession. "Really?" Lina tried to make her voice sound disinterested, but her heart had begun to beat rather quickly. "Was he hanged?" "Eventually." "Not for that?" "Oh, no. He killed at least a dozen people after Abbey." "In the same way?" "No. He went on to real poison afterwards." Lina produced quite a creditable laugh. "And I thought I'd found such an original idea. But after all," she added, very nonchalantly, "I suppose that wouldn't count as murder at all, would it? I mean, it isn't real murder, like giving the man poison, or shooting him, or anything like that." It was a question Lina had wanted very much to put for over 2 years now. Her own answer to it had quite crystallized by this time, but she had always wished to hear the opinion of someone else. All last summer she had tried to take the plunge and ask Isabel, but had never found the courage. Now it had just come out quite naturally. "That's rather a nice point." Miss Sedbusk's voice had taken on its debating tone. It resounded heartily through the garden of Delfield, till Lina wished that Isabel was fitted with a volume control like the wireless. "No, I'm inclined to doubt whether it would be murder from the legal point of view. The legal definition of murder is to kill with malice aforethought. Still, you've got the malice aforethought all right. And if he knowingly incited the man to commit an act which would result in his death... Take a parallel. Supposing it was a footbridge over a torrent that he'd torn through, and he incited the other man to cross it. That would certainly be murder, wouldn't it?" "Yes," said Lina unwillingly. "The distinction's a very fine one." "Wait, though," commanded Miss Sedbusk. "That isn't a true parallel. I see the flaw. The brandy turns on a question of general knowledge, whereas the footbridge is a piece of particular knowledge. The other man has just as much chance of knowing that a tumbler full of neat brandy will kill him as the other has." "Yes," Lina nodded eagerly. "That's just what I think. But with the footbridge, of course, he hasn't," firmly pursued Miss Sedbusk. "Yes, that's the difference. And in a matter like that of general knowledge, even if he did knowingly,
incite the other man, I should say the chances are that legally it wasn't murder."
"No," Lina agreed comfortably.
"But I'll ask my lawyer friend, whom I always pester with this kind of thing, to make sure, if you like."
"Oh, no, don't bother," Lina said hastily. "I'm really not in the least interested. In fact, I can't think how you can wallow in all that kind of thing, Isabel. Personally, I couldn't bear it."
"Well, I got the information about Abby from your own book on Palmer," returned Miss Sedbusk.
"Mine?"
"Or Johnny's. He lent it me last summer."
Oh, yes," Lina murmured. She had not had the least idea that Johnny had a book like that. She made a note of the name. Palmer. Usually, Lina found a curious and rather horrid fascination in encouraging Isabel Sedbusk to talk about murder, though it made her shiver at times to hear Johnny discussing it with her, in the bantering way he had adopted towards Isabel. But this was sailing rather too near the wind. She changed the subject. When Johnny had taken Isabel back to Maybury in the car, she went into the morning room and searched the bookshelf. There it was, The Life and Career of William Palmer of Rugeley, on the same shelf as Jorrocks and Ruff's Guide to the Turf. She felt quite angry with Johnny. He really was too confidently careless. She took the book away and hid it in her bedroom to destroy later. But she would read it first. Of course, Isabel had said that it wasn't murder. Lina had come to that conclusion herself a very long time ago. It had been a great consolation to her. If one's husband had not committed murder, then one's husband cannot reasonably be considered a murderer. Poison and pistols and Isabel's blunt instruments are the ingredients of murder, not a silly bet between two drunken men. It was the first time that Lina's heart had beaten at all rapidly over that subject for months. Not that she had come in the least to condone what Johnny had done. It was horrible even now to think about. But it had not been murder, and that does make all the difference. It was surprising, too, how little she did think about it consciously. But in her subconsciousness, Lina knew that it remained, and always would remain, as vivid as ever. Subconsciously, it influenced all her thoughts and most of her actions. The feeling that she and Johnny were cut off from the rest of the world had now become natural to her. Other people did not know it, but she did, and took it for granted. It no longer distressed her, really. It just meant that Johnny was not responsible for what he did, and she was his keeper, with a trust that she must never relax for an instant, and no one else must ever, ever know anything about it. She still had her moments of rebellion against the responsibility that had been laid on her, but they were not many. Time can accustom one to anything. And of course she had her compensations. Johnny had not relapsed again. This time he had stuck to what he said. The pages of the betting book remained blank. Johnny had made no bet for nearly 2.5 years. Lina felt that to have caused such a reformation, nothing could really have happened in vain. At times, Lina surprised herself with the way in which she had come to accept what had happened. She refused to suspect that she was taking the letter for the law. She was determined to believe the casuistry with which she consoled herself and defended Johnny. And she did believe it. Johnny, who could not distinguish right from wrong, had not thought that he was doing wrong, and therefore he had not done wrong. And in any case he had not committed murder, and that was a very great consolation. Moreover, Johnny did love her devotedly, and that was a very great consolation too. Johnny and she had been married now more than 10 years, and Johnny still loved her devotedly. Lina knew that. Johnny had not looked at another woman since she came back to him, and he had got over all that sort of thing. Lina knew that too. She was no longer the blind wife. Unconsciously, she was now on the alert the whole time for Johnny to stray. If he had strayed, she would have known at once. Johnny had not strayed. Lina loved him more than ever. She loved him tenderly, maternally, and passionately. She loved him so much that sometimes, alone, the tears would come into her eyes at the thought of loving so much and being so much loved. She actually loved Johnny all the more for the terrible things he had done. It proved that she was so necessary to him, and she adored being necessary to him, even though Johnny could never know just how necessary she was. Lina knew that she could never have loved Ronald like that. Johnny was such a model husband now, too. He hardly ever left Delfield at all. He gardened, played with his prize bulls and his roses, attended the county council, sat on the bench and potted. The complete country gentleman. Johnny was absolutely no trouble at all. But Lina never left him. She had not set foot in London since Beaky's death, except for 1 or 2 visits with Johnny. Her patient might be quite well again, but Lina knew she dared not leave her post. She did not want to leave it. She was happy. Incredibly, she thought sometimes, remembering everything. But she was happy. Johnny needed her, and she needed Johnny, and she was happy. It increased her happiness to know that Johnny was happy too. He was merrier in public and more affectionate to her in private than ever before. There was still more than a touch of the schoolmistress about his views of her, she knew, but that did not matter. Johnny's nature needed a schoolmistress, perhaps unconsciously welcomed one. It was far too inert to be able to remain upright without such a prop. And being accepted as a schoolmistress, Lina could not help behaving rather like one. She tried not to speak sometimes too peremptorily, or even dictatorially, but it was now she who took all the decisions as a matter of course. Johnny did not seem to mind. Lina thought he preferred it. His mind was lazy too. Hers had been disciplined. Johnny's never would be. So Lina now said what Johnny was to do, and Johnny, still with his schoolboy grin, did it. Lina never realized quite how much and how often she said what Johnny was to do. Lina considered it a measure of Johnny's regeneration that he should suddenly, in the autumn between Miss Sedbusk's 2 summers, have begun to take such an interest in insurance. The old Johnny had never thought beyond the moment. To skimp the present by safeguarding the future would have seemed to him madness. And yet here was the new Johnny, his desk littered with the pamphlets of various companies, poring over them day after day, comparing, taking notes, working out premiums and figures, all as if insurance were one of the most absorbing things in the world. Lina, coming into the morning room one rainy October afternoon, had to kiss the little new bald patch on the top of his head in order to bring him down to earth again. "Yes, but there's a lot in this insurance stuff," Johnny had told her earnestly. "No, there is really, Monkey Face. Look here, for instance. Supposing I died tomorrow." "Darling," said Lina fondly. "No, supposing I did. You'd be left without—" "Oh, no, you wouldn't. I was forgetting the boot was on the other foot."
Well, supposing you died tomorrow.
Lina sat down on the arm of a chair. Johnny really did mean business. I hope I shan't. But all right, suppose it.
Well, I might be left penniless, mightn't I?
Not quite penniless, darling. I'm leaving you enough to buy the matches for your cigarettes. Lina had made a will when she first inherited her money, leaving everything to Johnny. She had never told him so. No, but I might.
I don't know what's in your will. And, as I've always said, I don't want to. That's your pigeon. But for all I know, you may have left everything to Robert and Armorel. And even if you haven't, there are the death duties. Everyone ought to insure against death duties. You ought really, Monkey Face, you know.
Ought I, Johnny? Lina smiled. Yes, I mean it. Seriously. Lina knew perfectly well that she ought to be insured against death duties. Her solicitor had told her so repeatedly. She had never bothered to take the steps. I suppose I ought, she said reluctantly. She did not at all like the idea of parting with income to save somebody else capital after her death, even Johnny.
Well, it's about time. If you want anything like a decent premium. They get pretty high when you're over 40.
I'm not over 40, Lina said indignantly. I'm not 40 at all yet, as you very well know. She was 39. Johnny began to explain the figures. A policy, payable at death, was very much cheaper than an endowment policy. It was not necessary to have a profit-bearing policy, and so on. Johnny seemed to know all about it. I see, said Lina, as intelligently as possible. And how much ought I to take a policy out for? 1,000?
1,000? 10?
Johnny! The death duties couldn't come to anything like that.
I bet they would, or pretty nearly.
Wait a minute, I'll look it up in Whitaker. Johnny fetched Whitaker from the shelf and ran through the pages. Here we are. It's 50,000, isn't it? The duty on 50,000 is... Yes, I thought I was right. 10%. 10,000. And a policy for 10,000 will cost... Yes, you can get one for just over $250 a year. But, darling, we can't afford $250 a year. It's out of the question.
Can't we?
Johnny scratched his head. Look here, Monkey Face. It is important, you know. I tell you what you can do. Dock me 100 off my little lot, and that will leave you with only 150 to find. Johnny, that's very sweet of you. Lina was touched. But you couldn't manage on 400, could you?
It'd be a bit of a squeeze, Johnny said, nobly. But after all, it's only fair, isn't it? I mean, considering it's my advantage. That is, he added, if you are leaving me anything.
Oh, yes, Lina smiled. I am leaving you something. But I won't take 100 from you. I'll manage it myself somehow. She knew that really she could manage it quite well. She had never lived quite up to her income. The house was not expensive to run, and there were no children. But what you shall do, she added, is to take out an endowment policy for yourself too, with a premium of about £40 a year. Johnny's face fell. It won't do you any harm to learn to save a little, my lad, Lina laughed unsympathetically. A few days later, she paid the first premium on her policy. Johnny could be businesslike enough when he liked. But Lina soon had cause to wonder whether she had been wise in forcing Johnny to save against his will. Chancing to be in the morning room, a week or so later, she remembered that she had not looked at Johnny's betting book for some time. During the last year, her examinations of it had become more and more perfunctory. She opened the little drawer and took it out. There was a new entry, dated 3 days ago. It was only for £10, and the horse had won at 4-1, but the danger was there. Johnny had begun betting again. Lina wasted no time. She went at once to find Johnny potting bulbs in the greenhouse. "Johnny, do you remember my telling you nearly 2 years ago that if you ever had another bet I should leave you?" "Did you, monkey face?" "I believe you did say something like that. Look here, I'm putting the grand maître in this blue pot for the drawing-room. That all right? And do you remember me saying that if you ever did bet again I should know? What's the matter?" "Only this. I'm leaving you." "What?" "I gave you every warning," Lina said angrily. "I told you I wouldn't have it. Well, I won't. I'm going." "But what the devil?" "Do you deny that you've begun betting again?" "Certainly I do," said Johnny with dignity. "Then what about At a Boy last Wednesday at 4-1? "How the blazes," gasped Johnny. "Do you know anything about that?" "Never mind, I do know." Lina knew too that Johnny would never suspect her method of knowledge. Tampering with another person's private papers, even one's own husband's, is one of the things that simply do not occur. "Well, I'm blessed." "Anyhow," said Johnny candidly, "you're perfectly right. I made 40 quid on Attaboy. Got the tip from a man who really knows. It would have been a sin not to use it." "I'd offer to blue it with you, monkey face," Johnny grinned, "but it's going to pay for my insurance premium." "Johnny, did you hear what I said just now?" Lina was annoyed that Johnny did not seem to be taking her threat in the least seriously. "I heard you pulling my leg." "Indeed, I wasn't pulling your leg. I meant it." "Still," said Lina, with what dignity she could, "I'll give you one more chance, and the next time I do go. Remember, Johnny, I mean it. I don't care who gives you the tip. I don't care whether the wretched horse wins or loses. You are not to bet. If you do, I shall go." "Right," said Johnny. "And now we've settled that, tell me if the grand maître are all right for this bowl." Lina was worried. Johnny had been so offhand. He had not taken her threat seriously, and he had given no promise. She was very, very much afraid that Johnny did intend to take up betting again. And if he did, she did not know what she would do. The bare thought was a nightmare. But Johnny, it appeared, was not going to take up betting again after all. In her anxiety, Lina visited the little drawer in the morning room every single day. If she did not get an opportunity during the daytime, she went down specially from her bedroom at night, and there were no more entries. As the time went on, her worry ceased. Johnny had not taken up systematic betting again after all. It had been just a single bet, no doubt on the strength of the good tip he had mentioned. One bet does not make a sinner. The new Jekyll had not lapsed into the old Hyde. By the time Isabel Sedbusk arrived for her second summer, Lina had almost forgotten all about the incident. She had never noticed, on her first visit to the drawer, after tackling Johnny in the greenhouse, the piece of black cotton fastened across the face of the drawer, which her opening of it had dislodged. Chapter 18. Lina was putting on a new hat. She had bought it the day before, in Bournemouth. A little woven wisp of soft black Chinese hemp, and it was the most daring one she had ever possessed. One wore it completely on the side of one's head, right down to the left eyebrow, showing all one's hair on the other side. "Really," Lina had said, "I think this one's a little too—" "It suits you wonderfully, madam," the shop girl had assured her. "You have such a small face, and your hair—" Now Lina was delighted with it. She drew it on very carefully. One had to have one's hair just exactly so. With it, she was to wear her new blue woolen frock, her silver fox fur, and a pair of black kid gloves, also bought yesterday in Bournemouth, cut very wide and gauntlet-like at the wrist. The June afternoon was cold and gloomy. Lina wriggled and smoothed her fingers into the new gloves, and then studied the whole effect in her long mirror. It was good. "I bet there aren't many women of 40 who could carry off a hat like that," she meditated, and then corrected herself quickly, even in her thoughts. 39, because there is a very great difference between 39.5 and 40. Lina did not feel anything like 40. 40 marks an epoch in one's life. At 40, one cannot escape the suspicion that one is approaching middle age. Other people one considers definitely middle-aged at 40, and yet Lina felt less middle-aged now than before she had married. She had been an elderly young woman, she knew. She now felt an exceptionally youthful one, and her looks had not let her down. At that distance from the glass, only a few feet, she still looked comparatively young. Certainly no older than when Ronald had fallen in love with her so desperately. At that distance one could not see at all the faint clefts that ran from her nose to the corners of her mouth, and from the corners of her mouth down on either side of her chin. And when she held her head up, the little bagginess under her chin disappeared completely. She must remember to hold her head up. Mechanically she moved her head sharply from side to side and up and down, in the chin-reducing exercise which, with further exercises intended to tame the other more exuberant parts of her anatomy, she performed now very seriously, every single morning, naked, in her bedroom, only smiling faintly in response to Johnny's ribaldries. Lina never locked her bedroom door against Johnny, and never refused to say "come in" whenever he knocked. But she did wish he would not knock when she was doing her exercises. She looked at herself again in the glass, turning this way and that. No, she did not look the tiniest bit different from when Ronald had fallen in love with her. Lina still thought of Ronald quite often. She felt very tender about him. Ronald had helped her over a terrible period. Even now she did not know what she would have done without him then. But she was thankful that she had not gone away with him. Ronald had been right. She was a one-man woman. Nevertheless, she still wondered at times what Ronald would have been like in bed. Lina had not a very good imagination, except, like most women, as concerned herself, and she could not quite picture Ronald in bed. She thought he would probably have been much too respectful. He always had kept her on a pedestal, and then she would have had, very tactfully, to educate him up to being less so, which would have been a bore. Johnny had spoilt Lina for respect in love. She hoped Ronald was very happy with his wife, for Ronald was married now. Lina was not jealous of her in the least. She resettled her fur on her shoulders and went downstairs. "I'm ready, Johnny," Johnny looked at her. "This the whole outfit? Fine. Do I look all right?" Johnny had seen the new hat already last night, surmounting a pair of pale green step-ins, and had pronounced it with much enthusiasm the best ever. "All right, I'll say you do. A little bit of all right. That hat's going to knock 'em flat in Up-Cottery. Monkey face, you're a marvel. Come and be kissed this minute." "Careful then," Lina smiled. "Isn't it kiss-proof?" "No lipstick's kiss-proof against you, Johnny," Lina retorted. She kissed him with carefully pursed lips, holding him from clasping her too closely with her palms against his chest, and mindful of her powdered nose, which was just a fraction of an inch too long, and made kissing difficult after her face had been done. But it was wonderful of Johnny still to want to kiss his wife in the middle of the afternoon. "The car's outside," Johnny said. Lina was going to pay a first call on some new people in the neighbourhood, upon whom report had been favourable. Johnny was to drive her over, and she intended to walk back. The call was entirely an excuse to wear the new hat. Lina called in for tea an old Lady Royd, a connection by marriage of Johnny's, who lived all alone in a large house, most of it shut up, little more than a mile from Up-Cottery. Lina was very fond of the old lady, and made a point of going over to see her at least once a fortnight. "My dear, how nice of you to call in, and what a charming hat." "I'm rather pleased with it. You don't think it's a little too—" "No, I don't. It suits you so well." Over tea, Lina recounted where she had been. "Ah, you have called. Then I will. I hear they're very nice. You liked her?" "Yes. She was a Langsthwaite, I understand, one of the Gloucestershire lot. But I don't seem to know his name at all. However, my dear, if you've called—" Lina walked back to Delfield with a happy consciousness that she had had cream with her tea and did not care. Cream is good for one. It wraps up the nerves. Isabel Sedbusk and Major Scargill were coming to dinner, and she was looking forward to that. Life seemed very peaceful and very pleasant. Miss Sedbusk was talking about murder, as usual. She talked emphatically, thumping her fist on the dinner table. "I believe in murder," declaimed Miss Sedbusk. "All sorts of people ought to be murdered. It's a great pity one isn't allowed to do it." Lina smiled nervously. She knew that Isabel was only talking nonsense, but she did wish that Miss Sedbusk would not talk nonsense about murder in front of Johnny. "I saw in the paper this morning," she said, "that income tax ought to come down again in the next budget. I hope—" "As things are, of course, it needs an amount of nerve that few of us have got. I don't know," said Miss Sedbusk to Major Scargill across the table, "whether you ever read a book of mine called Ruddy Death." Major Scargill looked guilty. I don't know." "Well, it doesn't matter." Miss Sedbusk forgave him. "The point is that I dealt with the idea there. I wrote—" Miss Sedbusk explained at some length what she had written. She also explained other views. "Very interesting," said Major Scargill. "Lombroso, eh? Very interesting." "I thought Lombroso was quite exploded now, Isabel," put in Lina perfunctorily. Miss Sedbusk leaned impatiently aside while the parlour-maid removed her plate. "So he is. But I still think there might be something in his premises, though not in the deductions he made from them. For instance, there may not be a murderer's face, but there certainly is a degenerate's face.
And a good many degenerates come to murder. In other words, some murderers can be detected from their faces, but not all."
"Ha!"
said Major Scargill. "But what I do think," pursued Isabel, "is that one can often tell from a person's face whether he or she is capable of murder, though not, of course, whether he'll ever commit it. I find it quite amusing to look up and down a tube carriage and think, 'Yes, old man, you could commit murder if it came to the point.'"
"You do, eh? Well, what about dinner tables? What about us, eh, Miss Sedbusk? Could our hostess commit murder if it came to the point?"
Miss Sedbusk shook her head regretfully. "Lina hasn't the nerve, any more than I have. It's a pity in a way, but very few women have. After all, murderers are comparatively rare birds, you know. You couldn't, Major, for instance." "Well, that's comforting." "And as for you, old man," said Miss Sedbusk to Johnny, "you couldn't commit a murder if you tried for 100 years.
Lina caught her breath and waited for some bantering reply. Instead, Johnny said quite seriously and almost regretfully, "No, I don't believe I could." Johnny really thought that. He could not commit murder if he tried for 100 years. Well, no doubt he was right. After all, he never had committed murder. Lina was quite sure that Johnny never could have murdered Beaky in cold blood. He had not got either enough or too little moral strength. She glanced down the table at him. His eyes were on her, but for once there was no twinkle in them. He was looking at her with an odd mixture of gloom and affection, quite unlike his usual expression. Her heart gave a little jump. Surely, she thought, Johnny hasn't been taking Isabel's nonsense seriously. In the drawing-room after dinner, Lina had a curious experience. The men had remained in the dining-room only a very short time. They came into the drawing-room for coffee. The tray had been put on a small table near the piano, and Lina had poured it out there. Johnny handed the cups round and brought Lina hers. She sipped at it, unthinkingly, and noticed that it tasted a little peculiar. Instantly the thought jumped into her mind, has Johnny put arsenic in it? She sipped it again. It was peculiar. Johnny would get hold of a lot of money if he had put arsenic in Lina's coffee, and Johnny nearly always wanted money. She thought, in a detached way, am I going mad? She drank off the rest of her coffee. June passed into July. There was a spell of dry, hot weather, and Lina played tennis almost every day. Johnny was very good to her about tennis. It must have bored him very much, but he was always ready to play a set or two with her. Indeed, he came and asked her nearly every morning whether she would like a set. Lina enjoyed pottering about a court when there was no one to see her mistakes. Johnny did his best to coach her too, very patiently, but Lina never seemed to improve. "No, it's no good. I must be getting too old," she laughed, after half an hour's failure of the new whizzing service that Johnny was trying to teach her. "You are patient with me, darling," she added, with sudden gratitude for Johnny's wasted time. "I like doing things with you, monkey face," Johnny said, rather wistfully, Lina thought. "Well, I like doing them with you," she smiled. It was true that Johnny liked doing things with her nowadays. He did everything with her. He never went out anywhere without her, except, of course, on business or duty. And for the last month or two, Lina had noticed that he was continually coming to her and asking if she wanted him or if she would like to do anything with him. Lina was delighted. Never had Johnny been more attentive to her, and that really was saying something in Johnny's case. He was completely cured of his old fever for new women. In fact, Lina thought, since Beaky's death, her marriage had been practically ideal. There had been little quarrels, of course, and once, at the beginning of the present year, Johnny had asked her to lend him £5,000 of her capital for some new scheme of his own, which Lina had refused with decision, not unjoined with one or two hard words, but on the whole, things had been just about as good as they possibly could be. But for Johnny's moral weakness, their marriage always would have been ideal. Lina was thankful that the idyll had come later instead of at the beginning. For it really was an idyll now. Lina thought, with a little giggle, that lately Johnny had taken actually to following her about, just like a lovelorn boy of 17. It was extraordinary, and most gratifying. Lina was so much touched that she could not find the heart to hint to Johnny that at times he was becoming a positive nuisance. The only odd thing was that Johnny was not nearly so merry now. Lina had noticed him at that dinner with Isabel Sedbusk and Major Scargill, looking at her down the table in an odd, most un-Johnny-like way, and since then she had intercepted much the same sort of look several times. It was a peculiar look, as if Johnny could not make up his mind whether he liked what she was wearing, but liked her so much that it did not matter what she wore. Lina had asked him once with a smile what he was thinking about, and Johnny had seemed to give himself a mental shake, grinned, and replied that he was wondering whether to put on a clean pair of white trousers that afternoon or make the others do once more. Lina had been quite disappointed. Johnny's maudlin behaviour had given Lina a new sense of that power which women feel when they are very much loved, and soon take for granted, and so often abuse. She had not had quite the same feeling ever since she had kept Ronald Kirby on his string. She had never been quite sure of Johnny before, and any feeling of power there had been over him had been the influence of a steady mind over a shiftless one, and much resented. Now, at last, she was convinced that Johnny would never again do anything that would upset or hurt her, not merely because he respected and was even a little frightened of her, but because he adored her. It was a very comfortable feeling. She tried hard not to be impatient or snap at him, as she so often did when any suggestion, even of the most unimportant order, did not encounter her approval. Isabel and Lina were talking about investments. Isabel had just sold the film rights of one of her books for £1,000, and she was undecided what to do with the money. "I'd like to spend it on going round the world, but I suppose I'd better not. I can save up for that out of income, and this ought to be treated as capital. The rest of my money's in war loan, but I think I'd like something more exciting. What's yours in, Lina?" "War loan too. A safe 5%, said Lina, knowledgeably. Yes, till the Bolshies take the country over." Miss Sedbusk was inclined to take a gloomy view of England's future, perhaps not more gloomy than the governors of England's present warranted. "You wait and see what income tax will be then." "Income tax is bad enough, but it's the death duties I think are so monstrous. Do you know that when I die, Johnny will have to pay £10,000 in death duties. 10,000, said Lina with pain.
Nonsense, replied Miss Sedbusk robustly.
Why nonsense?
Because it is nonsense. 20%?
10%.
Hello? You're a richer woman than I thought. I didn't know you'd got 5,000 a year.
I haven't. Barely half that.
Then your arithmetic's wrong, my dear girl. 10% of 50,000 is 5,000.
Is it? Said Lina. Is it? By the time she got home, she had thought it out. It must have been a genuine mistake, because Johnny had not benefited. Lina had made the cheque out to the insurance company, not to Johnny. Johnny could not possibly have benefited. After the first horrid apprehension, that had been a tremendous relief. But it was a nuisance, and extremely careless of Johnny to have led her into paying just twice as much for her insurance as she need have done. Of course, the policy would have to be cancelled. "Johnny," she said, crossly, "you really are an idiot. What's 10% of 50? 5, of course," said Johnny in surprise. "Why?" "Because in that case, 10% of 50,000 is 5,000, of course. How could you have been so careless? You made me waste £128 too much on my insurance premium last October. We don't want a policy for 10,000 at all. It ought to have been 5. Really, you ought... What's the matter?"